Ani, Nanabujo, Niji Nijikwa. My name is Jeff Laux. I'm the Executive Director, acting in this role as the Executive Director for the First Nations Housing and Infrastructure Council here in British Columbia. And I want to welcome you today to our webinar entitled Funding and Financing, Housing and Infrastructure for the Future. I think we have a great panel for you today and a good opportunity for you to ask a lot of questions from expert people. But I wanted to welcome you here today. The First Nations Housing and Infrastructure Council of BC is located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, and in particular the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations. And we just want to make sure that we acknowledge that before we start. As we've been doing for our other webinars, we want to take and start the day in a good way. And to do that, we're going to call on Doug Harris, who will start us with a prayer and song. Doug, if you would.
Haichka, Jeff. Haichka. Aisquail Mucklwait. Good day, everyone. Nawilam Mucklwait. Welcome, everyone. Siem Nasietya, respected friends and relatives. Aintha. Doug Harris. Qualmoch Sne Talhuilam. Tani Tanal the Stuminus Tamoch. Thakmin. Asiem Nasalhuan. Na Sietya. Na Eli Schwatlaqua. Haitzapka. A Quasialip. A Tanaquail. I Yatzelt. E Tsitsi Watzelt. Wea sansa si wea sansa ni tanashta Sansa Ataha Ha Stihuya Haichka Titasian Atanaquail Ti Huimitol Atanaquail E Tamuk Squail Statlamsta Haichka Haitzapka. Back to you, Jeff. Haichka.
Rich, Doug, thank you very much for that. Thank you, everybody, for participating with us this morning again. I'm looking forward to this webinar and this session on the topic of funding and financing. I think we have three very dynamic speakers for you today. A good opportunity to hear from people who have a vast and varied background and resume to be able to offer us on the subject. A few things from housekeeping before we get started, and then I'll introduce each of our speakers. I'll introduce them to you first, and then I'll give you a little bit more background in the way of a biography when we actually call on each one of them to say a few words. Just a bit of housekeeping, as I say, to start, because we want to make sure that everybody knows how we're doing things. At the bottom of the screen, you will see the icon that says Q&A. We'd ask you to submit your questions through that. We'll monitor them at our end, and we'll try to get to all of the questions that that you ask before the day is over. We have an hour today, so the hope is what we want to do is to try to give more time for questions and more time to have interaction and discussion with our three guests today. So just put your Q&A into the icon. We'll follow them. We'll get them asked as much as possible. Any questions that don't get asked, we will be responding to them after the seminar, and we will post them on the web. So your question will be dealt with if it doesn't get answered during the actual webinar. Our apologies, but we will get answers back to you. What the format is for today is each of our three speakers will make a short presentation on their particular area of expertise and offer us some insight and some hopefully provocative thinking on what we can start to think about in the way of funding and finance. I may ask a few questions as we go through the session, but for the most part, I'm going to leave the majority of Q&A to come from you, our audience. Then I'm going to turn it over after the presentations are done, and we'll do a full Q&A session. Probably half of the webinar today will be spent on the exchange between yourselves and the three speakers responding to your questions. Our three speakers today are Tracy Antoine from the Royal Bank of Canada, Wendy Ham from AFOA BC, and Jason Callan from Squamish First Nation. And Jason has been involved in a variety of functions. I've looked at the resumes for all of our speakers, and I could probably take the majority of the hour just reading their resumes and all the things that they've been doing. So we have people who are well versed in this area to be able to help us understand it better today. Let me do first then, our first speaker will be Tracy. Tracy will be followed by Jason, and then following Jason will be Wendy. And as I say, the format is I'll turn it over to them. We'll hold our questions unless there's something provocative that needs to be maybe asked, and we'll go from one speaker to the other. Our first speaker today is Tracy Antoine. Tracy is from the Royal Bank of Canada. Tracy worked with First Nations governments for over 20 years in various roles, such as housing management and community planning. She began her career with RBC in 2006 and has held many positions in the retail division over a period of 5 years, including branch manager, and then joined the commercial financial services team as a senior commercial account manager, Indigenous markets, and traveled into many First Nations community in BC from 2011 to 2017. So I'm sure many of you on the webinar today have met Tracy in some capacity. Tracy then moved into a role of Senior Manager, Indigenous Credit Initiatives and Implementation, working with the National Director of Indigenous Markets with a focus on two key policies, housing and commercial Indigenous market credit. Most recently, Tracy joined the BC leadership team as the Vice President of Indigenous Markets. So a varied background and a lot of experience with British Columbia. Tracy, we'll turn it over to you first.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Jeff, for that introduction. I just wanted to reflect a little bit on the fact that I've been working in and around housing and infrastructure in many different, from many different viewpoints based on my work history. I always wanted to kind of shuttle off and get away a little bit from housing because it was something that I did for 8 years for a First Nations government that was very progressive thinking. But when I reflect back on it, I do now realize that a lot of what drove the success of the housing programs and the multiple types of programs that were used, and we used and grabbed every program out on the market, government programs, bank programs, as well as leasehold lending mortgages offered through most of the banks. A lot of it fell back to the land management regime that the community decided to go with. As you all know, there's many out there that range from Indian Act to modern day treaty, and RBC is very well rehearsed in all of those. And I was very grateful to be able to work in national office to help build an on-reserve housing policy to assist with better understanding those programs. So I come to you in this webinar today with a varied background of housing experience and program development and working on various models with many First Nations in the province to assist with building a strategy, not only for rural housing, but urban housing strategies. With that, it would include working with First Nation governments and their various departments, which would include housing, taxation, land, are the key managers that need to sit down and talk about how are we going to not just collect applications from the membership, but how are we actually going to achieve housing then? Are there challenges based on land base or the lack of? Purchasing land. Many communities are now faced with a large deposit coming in, whether it be through settlements or government negotiations or industry negotiations for IBAs. rural and urban housing strategies have their own structure that need to be taken into consideration. And I believe that that would be a great topic for us to be able to explore more together today.
Thank you, Tracy. Okay, I'm going to turn it now. I don't have any questions for you, but I'm sure that that will stimulate some because our last webinar was on that very subject. We had a conversation about on-reserve, off-territory, off-nation housing and the differences and the challenges that both face. So I'll look forward to some of those questions. Thank you for that. Our next speaker is Jason Callan. And when I introduced Jason, I didn't identify him with any particular entity because he's been around the world on a variety of fronts and a variety of places. So let me add a bit more detail and background to Jason's experience. He's worked with First Nations for over 2 decades. He served 3 terms as Secretary Treasurer of the FNHA, the First Nations Health Authority, and Chair of its Finance and Risk Management Committee. He has advised on options for participation in major research projects. He has worked on comprehensive community plans, including financial analysis of a First Nations government's fiscal position in different infrastructure, finance, and development scenarios. And he's completed a Bachelor of Commerce from UBC in 1994 and a Master's in Science from the London School of Economics and Political Science in 1998. Jason is also a member of the Squamish Nation, on whose traditional territory our office sits. Thank you, Jason, and welcome.
Thanks for the introduction, Jeff, and thanks for the invitation to participate today with the other panelists. I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and do want to say thanks to Doug for the starting us off in a good way today as well. So I have been spending my time recently thinking a lot more about infrastructure, and have been working with a new initiative called the First Nation Infrastructure Institute, and really thinking about the planning and the procurement of infrastructure projects and how they can be developed to get ready to be funded and financed. And I think the reason that I'm really interested and excited about this is I have had a chance to work on a number of community planning initiatives. And in those initiatives, what I've heard from multiple communities is that there is a priority on housing. There is a priority on creating improved and upgraded community facilities, and that there's more members that probably live off reserve that in some cases would like to move home and live with their communities. And so communities are trying to find a way to figure out, well, where can we put the housing? Where can we put the community facilities? How are we going to pay for those facilities? What are the services that those facilities or houses require? And how are we going to pay for the operation and maintenance of those facilities? And those questions are difficult to answer in some cases because First Nations may not have enough land to accommodate the locations for the houses that they would like to have, or the community facilities. In some cases, there's challenges associated with the funding and the financing of the building of those facilities. In some of my work, what I find interesting or have found interesting is that where there's land acquisition costs, in fact, those land costs have been small in comparison to the infrastructure costs that are required to service the lots, that are required to service the community facilities. And so thinking about infrastructure, I think in a detailed way, is an important part of thinking about housing. And there's no doubt there's many aspects to housing, complex area, including the type of housing structures, mortgage finance, and other issues. But again, I think coming back to the infrastructure idea, thinking about the cost of that infrastructure and whether Canada is going to be able to pay for the costs of that. That's certainly something we know that Canada has a responsibility to participate and contribute to the costs of some infrastructure, but it may make sense also for some communities to develop some of their own local revenue tools that would be able to support some of the costs. And with that in mind, certainly using some of the tools of initiatives like the First Nations Fiscal Management Act, the revenue tools that are possible through that, to recover some of the costs associated with the development of infrastructure, and to use some of the financing tools, whether it's with the First Nations Finance Authority, that's part of that act, or whether it's with other funding and financing partners like perhaps the Royal Bank or others. I know we hear about the Canada Infrastructure Bank and its mandate, and it's not quite clear yet to me how Indigenous people and communities fit into that. But I think it's sort of looking at, and if we think about the discussion topic today of funding and financing, and if a First Nation is looking to develop a plan for its infrastructure package, what is that community goal? What is that community vision in terms of land use? And how are the contributions from Canada going to be put towards a financial plan that could include other funding sources, including revenues collected by the First Nation, including financing from lenders, and putting that plan together in a sort of business case. I think that sets out, how the project's going to work, why you're doing the project, the costs of doing the project. What are the, if you're getting feasibility studies done, what are the indicative costs associated with that? What are the revenues you're going to have to repay the costs? How are you going to procure the project? Doing a whole of life cost, we understand there's a big disconnect between just the construction costs, and sometimes the operation and maintenance costs aren't fully accounted for, which leads to a shorter life cycle of the asset. And last but not least, a management case. So I think it's really, what I've been thinking about in the work that we've been doing with the First Nation Infrastructure Institute is how can we support Indigenous communities to develop a business case for their infrastructure project so that we can match up the projects with the lenders, because we know there is money there that wants to get placed into projects that people want to invest. But we need to, I think, do that due diligence in the planning and procurement to be able to match it up, to make sure there's an effective risk management framework in place so the project can get delivered on time, so it can get delivered on budget, and so it can last for its useful life. So I'll pause there, Jeff, and look forward to having more discussion. I know both the organizations, AFOABC and Royal Bank, are doing great work, and I think there's probably a lot of complementarity with some of the ideas that I've just talked about. So thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Jason. Two things that we'll come back to for both you and Tracy is a bit of a discussion on financing tools. You both touched on them briefly, and we'll talk a bit more as we go forward. Our next speaker is Wendy Ham. And Wendy joined the AFOABC as their executive director in 2019. She is a chartered professional accountant and a certified Aboriginal finance manager, and holds a certificate in First Nations tax administration through the TULO Center of Indigenous Economics at Thompson Rivers University. Prior to her role at AFOABC, Wendy was the finance manager and tax administrator at Sumas First Nation for 7 years, and I thought I recognized her. We were neighbors. I lived next door. She has been a member of AFOABC since 2014 and was part of the team at Sumas First Nation who received a Best Practices Award from AFOABC in 2017. Wendy's experience in finance and administration is long and varied, as she has worked in the post-secondary education and not-for-profit sectors. She is a firm believer in lifelong learning and is honored to work with all the First Nations in BC. So with that, I'll turn it over to Wendy.
Thank you for the introduction, Jeff. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for having me today. And I am thrilled to be on the panel with both Tracy and Jason. They bring so much knowledge and perspective to this subject. AFOABC's mandate is building capacity together, and I think that one of the biggest issues is actually setting the groundwork before trying to finance and any infrastructure projects that you're looking for. But I think my perspective comes from, I worked as a finance director in a First Nation, which had, housing issues as well as infrastructure issues. And they're always a challenge. And of course, there's never enough funding from Indigenous services to be able to do exactly what you want to do. So you have to find innovative ways to finance these projects, and there are a lot out there, and I think that as both Jason and Tracy spoke to already, there are a lot of good ideas out there and options that are available I think, with any First Nation, I think it starts, and I think Jason touched on this, with a land use plan and a CCP, which gives you an understanding of how you want to use the land to determine whether, what you need to do and how you need to go about doing it. One thing that I'm a true believer of is that it takes a whole community to put this together. It's not just one department. It's not land's responsibility or EgDev's responsibility or housing's responsibility. It's the community as a whole's responsibility to look at all the different components, because it's not just one side of things. Finance has to be a part of it, of course. But in my experience, one of the things that was apparent, early on in my time as a finance manager was to look at how we could use our own source revenues and our, what we had at our disposal to try and generate some local revenues and own source revenues to be able to support these projects. And there were a number of different options that came out of that. Especially around, and as Jeff mentioned, that I have my certificate in property tax administration. And it's not just property tax, but it's taxation in whole. So there are many ways that you can use, taxation laws to be able to support financing for infrastructure, whether it be through DCCs, development cost charges, where you have developers who develop on your land and they pay for the infrastructure. There's the options of using local revenues from property taxation, not from your members. You don't tax your members, you tax leaseholders who come onto your land and lease your land, and they can be held to a position of paying for some of your infrastructure or supporting that payment through, whether it be through a revitalization clause in your tax laws or through, development cost charges, or, there's a lot of different service taxes as well. So there's a lot of options to explore, and you have to figure out what's right for your nation. And but we are so lucky in this province to have so many really well-educated and well experienced people who can support that. And that's one of the things that we try to do, is just support and find those people and those experts to be able to help you through whatever challenges you may have. So with that, like I said, it takes a village. I think it takes a whole lot of planning and speaking, to all of your departments to work together to try and come up with solutions. And with that, I'll take it back to you, Jeff.
Thanks very kindly, Wendy, and thank you for that. I'm going to turn it over to Q&A shortly, but before I do that, I want to follow up on some of the comments that all of you, or each of you, have made. And I mentioned earlier the thing around financing tools and finding various tools that might be available. So what I do is I'll ask each of you to chime in maybe however you like, but I'd like to know from your perspective, what are the challenges in finding funding or financing for housing and infrastructure? Wendy, you mentioned things like DCCs and tax revenues and those kind of things just a moment ago. That obviously doesn't apply for every First Nation. So we all have a variety of challenges. So I'd like each of you to maybe consider and tell me what you think the major challenges to funding and financing are for First Nations. I'll start with Jason. I'll work backwards this time.
Great, thanks, Jeff. And before I do that, maybe I just wanted to build on. I really liked what Wendy said there about who's the different departments. And I know we are doing a pilot project right now with the community, and it has been really like multiple. We have a counselor involved, we have the Department of Finance involved, we have the property tax department involved, we have the public works, the operators of the infrastructure involved, we have the communications people involved, because we have community engagement sessions to talk about the possible, feasibility work that's going to be underway and the possible improvements. We have the people from the comprehensive community plan who had been involved in the development of that plan involved to talk about how we're trying to address some of the issues they raised in the plan. And certainly last but not least, we have people from the lands department. So you're bang on. It seems to me like you have, for these projects, it's a wastewater project. You really need to have people from a lot of different parts of the administration. You need a project champion, I think, to be able to advance the project, and you need to be checking in with leadership regularly to make sure they're on board to support it. And the other thing that I really liked, and maybe this is one of the challenges, Jeff, but just thinking about, so using some of the tools and how do you use some of the tools. One of the things that seems to me is on reserve, we have sometimes two worlds. We have the economic development world, and then we have the member housing part of the reserve. And we're looking to Canada, in some instances, to get funding for infrastructure for the members part of the reserve. And we're maybe looking for whoever's leasing the land, whether it's a commercial tenant, whether it's a residential non-member resident, to pay for their part of the infrastructure. And they seem to be two separate worlds, which can lead to, it seems to me, some inefficiencies. So what happens though if you're thinking about a water wastewater system and you have these two worlds? Are you going to have two different systems, or are you going to have one shared system with a network that connects everyone? And if you're going to have a shared network, in some parts of the system, you're probably going to have a shared network. You're going to have shared facilities. You're going to have a wastewater treatment facility that both members and non-member residents or businesses use. And if you're going to have that shared infrastructure, how are you going to allocate the costs associated with that infrastructure to either Canada to pay for or the non-members? And how do you develop a financial plan that allocates the costs in a fair and equitable manner? And I think it's fair to say that members are probably very concerned about subsidizing the non-member residents or businesses. They want to make sure that those businesses or residents are going to pay their fair share of the cost of the infrastructure. And similarly, to attract investment and to attract businesses, and you need to ensure that there's a fair, there's quality being provided. So I think, developing that, it seems to me to be a challenge, is how do we develop, again, come back to the planning part of it, but the planning and procurement of a project that can fairly and equitably distribute the costs associated with it. And for sure, in some instances, it seems to me there may be nations that are able to generate their own revenue. Perhaps it's from on reserve, perhaps it's from off reserve benefit sharing agreements. But maybe there's some cases where they're not able to generate revenue. And in those cases, I still think developing that plan to manage the risk could be an important thing for something I hope we can talk about a little bit, which is monetizing transfers and having a long-term funding agreement that would enable you to finance a project over time.
Thanks, Jason. We will get to that. There are questions coming in, and I will go to them in a moment, but I'm going to let Tracy and Wendy basically have a chance to respond to that question about the challenges that are out there for funding and financing. And Jason touched on at the same time what some of the opportunities might be. So in that, sort of roll this all into one larger question: what are the challenges in funding and financing? And as a result of, what may be the opportunities that we're not picking up? Tracy, would you go ahead?
Sure, thanks, Jeff. So something that I see quite often, and it's probably common for most First Nations, not just in BC, but across the country, it's the early use of the government programs under CMHC, where you were provided assistance to create a housing policy, but over standing the test of time, we're finding on a community's balance sheet a lot of member loans based on arrears or lack of payment for their monthly rent, whether it be to a life circumstance, death in the family, a divorce, or something has happened where the revenue stream coming into that home is now not enough to help them cover off the rent, but they're quietly ashamed or embarrassed to step forward and look for assistance and look for the other programs that might be able to assist outside of the CMHC subsidy. So when you look at the balance sheet and you start looking at a nation's debt service covenants and other ratios, free cash flow ratios, it is impactful on their ability to borrow. So RBC, of course, is one of the top 5 banks in Canada, big 5. I mean, we often look at ratios and how can we help overcome such a situation, and we'll go in and do strategic planning sessions between all of those departments that include housing and taxation, and now we're looking at 10-year block funding where maybe we can assist with alleviating, but organizations such as the Assembly of First Nations has created a great housing policy template, which also does have some impact on and provide some insight on those types of issues that are long-term challenges, because it's something that nobody has a really easy answer to. Again, it'll go back to the land management regime the community manages, because some of them are on certificate of possession land. So how do you evict a member off of their own property that has, of course, legally been signed over to the nation, but it doesn't make working with your membership at home any easier. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges I see is arrears, which affects, at the end of the day, the balance sheet and the cash flow.
Thank you. Thank you, Tracy. Okay, Wendy, we'll turn it over to you on your ideas about the challenges for funding and financing and what some of the opportunities might be.
Yeah, well, Tracy, I totally agree with you on the housing arrears is, I think, a challenge for every community, and there's not an easy answer to that one. I will go back again to also what Jason said. I think one of the challenges is that there has to be so much planning that goes into this, both from a housing perspective for members and from infrastructure planning. And, it starts with making sure that you have a CCP and land use plan to start there to figure out how you want to, to use your land, and then planning, having the capacity to develop whatever you need to get to that point. And I think that's one of the biggest, the resource challenges that a lot of First Nations have is a big one. And so that's a huge challenge that I hear over and over again from communities, is just having the resources, and that's not even monetary resources, but human resources to be able to manage the projects and to handle all of the things that need to go into these large projects. And whether it be just building a house, that's a project unto itself, and there's so many different nuances. But there is also, I think, one of the opportunities is I, in the past year that I've been working with AFOA, one of the things that has come to the forefront over and over again is there are many First Nations organizations out there, such as the Housing and Infrastructure Council, the Infrastructure Institute, the AFOA, the First Nation Public Service Secretariat. There's a variety of organizations out there who are working really hard to try and be able to support First Nations in these projects, and guiding them to experts in those different fields. And I think the opportunities is that we all need to work together to try and support each other. The other thing is to support each other. If you have, if you are First Nations that border each other or have reserves that are close by, pooling resources and working together in a larger capacity is also a great way to try and look at those bigger projects as a way to support each other and support that infrastructure. So those are just a couple of ideas from an opportunities perspective, but we're always here to just try and support and build that capacity so that First Nations have the ability to to build the baseline, the groundwork, and then work up from there.
So don't put your computer on mute just yet, Wendy, because a couple of questions that have come in that you started to address with some of your comments, dealing with basically specific sources of funding. So you mentioned a few entities, institutions, et cetera, that might be of assistance. But what people are asking right now is, what are some of the specific sources where people can go? And I know Tracy is anxious to answer this question too. But what are some of the specific sources where they can get the funding, what type of requirements are made, and what they can do specifically for infrastructure, but also obviously for housing?
Yeah. So there's a few places that I mean, as far as housing goes, one of the organizations that I have been dealing with is First Nation Market Housing Fund. They're national, but they have a lot of capacity development dollars that they can to support First Nations in being able to build that capacity and support that. I would, there's, I'm trying, you've put me on the spot, all the different ones that I'm trying to think of. The First Nation Finance Management Board is another place that you can, they are funded and they are able to support First Nations who want to look at moving under the Fiscal Management Act rather than getting, moving off of the Indian Act. And they have some programs that may be able to support that development. And there are a few, the Finance Authority, of course, Jason touched on this, the First Nations Finance Authority is one of those places where you can look at funding for infrastructure projects. And, I know during this pandemic, one of the things that they talk about is they're, willing to support, right away any projects that are shovel ready. Which is a whole nother thing about what is exactly shovel ready, but that's one of the areas. So those are a few of the, for financing. As far as funding, I think one of the first places you start is Indigenous services, but I think also talking to RBC and other institutions that are able to look at ways that they can help with that kind of thing. There's also, because I think that, we forget that, if you have if you have a trust or if you have something like that, you can look at leveraging those kind of funding, even at, preserving that capital, but looking at ways you can use that to leverage some financing for those different projects.
Thank you for that. Sorry to put you on the spot. But Tracy, she's giving you the segue by suggesting that RBC might be a place that you could talk to about some of this as a source of funding or financing. Does something like that come to mind for you?
It absolutely does. And we've been doing a lot of strategic planning around wealth management and cash flow projections. As everyone that has registered knows, that there's different things that have come to the table for First Nations communities to utilize in the form of 10-year block funding, gaming revenues, taxation revenues, other IBA agreement dollars. Sorry about that. There's somebody outside my window. And then being able to use products that financial institutions have available, like an infrastructure line. So we would generally look at anything 5 million and above that would assist the community in putting infrastructure in, which includes water, power, sewer, or water treatment plants. So not very many projects will fall under that $5 million mark, because they're very expensive for being able to implement for a certain number of homes in a certain area. So it's gonna, take into account land base. How many units are you looking to build, and what sources of revenue do you have for that? So, for example, we could do infrastructure loans for setting up a full subdivision under leasehold lending. And then we would look at having the revenues from the leasehold lending and the taxation revenues that could be a source of debt repayment in addition to future collection to cover off such a loan of that size. So there are definitely financial strategies we can sit down and work through with the community from a strategic planning viewpoint, but financing is always available. And right now, with the way the rates are, preserving capital in a wealth management investment portfolio is definitely recommended. And being able to leverage, we wouldn't recommend any more than 10% off a portfolio such as that to cover off these long-term expenses.
Great, thank you. Jason, I'm going to come over to you now because you touched on something. It's the same sort of question, but you touched on something earlier about planning and about long-term funding. And I wanted to just get your insight into that. It's the same kind of question about sourcing, but some of the questions that are coming up talk about refinancing existing portfolios, talk about a variety of asking about a variety of different ways to strategize on how you address the funding and the needs that you have for your various communities. So what you talked about longer term funding approaches, what were you asking or talking about there?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it is interesting thinking about the different funding sources that a community might have and how they could put together a financial plan. And you heard from, I think, Wendy and Tracy just now about, some own source revenues, which I think they could be, there's development cost charges and property taxes that have been mentioned. There are actually some additional tools in the Fiscal Management Act that are also maybe not used as much. One's called a service tax, and that's where a specific infrastructure cost can be, amortized or applied to the area where people are receiving services, and that cost is, just basically paid off over time. And then once the cost is paid off, the tax, I think, is no longer needed. So that's a different type of cost recovery mechanism, which I think is also useful to think about. And the other thing is ongoing fees, which I think are possible under the Fiscal Management Act. So I would say, like, it is worth thinking through these individual tools. And, if you wanted to talk to folks more about them at the First Nation Tax Commission, they'd be able to provide you with some more information specifically about those types of cost recovery mechanisms. To the extent that you can generate some revenue associated with those, they can be helpful for the project. But I hear what I think people are saying. Well, what if we don't have those? Like, what can we think about a long-term funding agreement? With Canada, maybe there's 10-year grants available now. What if we use the strength of that grant agreement to be able to somehow finance or contribute to the cost of our infrastructure project? And I think, that's something that certainly people have thought a lot about, I think, and sometimes it's called monetizing transfers. I think the idea being, if you're going to get a transfer payment for every year for the next 10 years or longer, could we somehow go out and borrow today, but based on the strength that we were going to use that transfer payment over successive years to repay the loan that we took out today? And that idea is attractive from a number of perspectives, because it seems to me if a First Nation doesn't have its own source revenues, it would be able to deliver infrastructure today that it might not be able to otherwise. And that infrastructure could meet these that have been established through their comprehensive community plan. The challenges to that, I think, are some concerns about the way that projects are planned and delivered, and really into a sort of risk framework type of discussion. And the concern about that the government of Canada might have, that I think we need to be able to address, is concerns around the delivery of the project, the scale of the project, the scope of the project, that it's actually going to get built and it's going to be delivered on time. Because if there's a financing that's undertaken, and then there's the financial transactions in place, but for whatever reason around the plan and the construction of it, it's not able to be built, now you've just got a transaction that's a financial transaction with no actual project. And that's obviously a concern, because you're not addressing the community need. I think the second risk is with respect to the financial risk, and that's the cost of the project. And we know that when we do feasibility studies, there can be Class C or Class D cost estimates that maybe will be between plus or minus 30% of the cost. So what is the swing in the cost, and is that plus or 30% the actual swing, or is it actually even higher than that? Because for whatever reason, the gap between the time the feasibility study is done and the time the funding's in place takes too long, and then the market has changed, the costs have gone up. And so the plus or minus isn't just 30%, it's actually higher. And so again, you get into a situation, well, did we borrow enough to be able to actually pay for the assets, or does the asset get? I come back again to the planning approach, maybe the procurement approach, which could assign the risks to the parties most effective to manage them. And that's really figuring out the company that you're going to get to deliver your project, you're going to get to build it, and what their responsibilities are in the construction of the project. So I think some of those things could be quite effective at helping to address the risks. And if we're able to do the plans and build the business cases in an effective way that manages those risks well, we may be in a better position to argue with Canada to say we can manage those risks, enter into a long-term transfer agreement with us, and we will deliver the projects on time and on budget, and we will be able to address the community needs now. And I say that, I'm using the extreme, examples, a community that has a bunch of own source revenue on one hand, or a community that has none. In reality, what's probably the more realistic is that communities have a bit of both. And so even communities that have own source revenue, would they want to monetize some of their transfer? They might. I don't know. Or so I could see building a financial case, which I think would be really interesting, which is, it could use term transfer, it could use some of the own source revenue, and it could be a financial a plan with a lender like Royal Bank. It could be a financial plan with a lender like the First Nations Finance Authority, or others, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and you put together these revenue streams, and you get the revenue today, or the financing today to build the project. But also you need to take into account that operation and maintenance, I think, over the life cycle. So we need to include those costs in the financial plan as well. So I think those are some exciting ideas that maybe, and I'm sure Royal Bank would like to see more projects that had revenues associated with them, because they would be able to finance more projects. And again, AFOA BC does great work in capacity development. So understanding these projects is not the easiest thing to do, the financial plan, and all the work that AFOA BC, I think, greatly contributes to helping people to understand how to put these together. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you very much. I'm cognizant of time. We have about 10 minutes left. There's a couple of themes in some of the questions that are being asked from our audience. And one has to do with on and off territory, off reserve, on reserve. Obviously, a lot of the financing, a lot of the consideration we give is to what we can do in a way of finding funding or being able to address housing infrastructure needs in the community on reserve. But I think it was Jason or others that have mentioned earlier on that a large majority, a large percentage of First Nations citizens don't live at home. They live away. So how do some of the First Nations find funding or opportunities to be able to address the needs of those people who live away, people who look for renovation assistance or for other financing or funding assistance? I'm going to start with you, Tracy, because I know that that's something that the Royal Bank obviously does. But what would you suggest is something that people should be looking at in ways that they could assist those who live away?
So for those that live away from home, and if they are, I'm assuming that they own their homes and are on fee simple lands, it's going to be a case-by-case situation, of course, but when you're off reserve, you do have some borrowing power against that land to use as equity, in addition to the amount of mortgage has been paid off, so you can reborrow or refinance up against that for renovations, because what the banks want to see is extending the life of the home. But that also, you know, in turn begs the question of, well, what do we do for those homes that are on reserve that have had the CMHC mortgage paid off? How can you refinance that to, you know, renovate those as well? The short answer is yes. It's not as easy, but yes, it definitely can be done. And then you would set up something similar to the CMHC contribution agreement to repay that debt as well, right? So like first, most reserves right now that are urban are on leasehold lands. So they definitely have a lending value to them that will support renovations. Not sure if I could get a little bit more information on who's asking that question, what the situation is, so I could better answer that. But from a kind of an open-ended kind of solution, it's always best to talk to your local retail branch that does understand on reserve housing and off reserve housing.
Good, thank you. We'll come back to you. There's another one that sort of follows up to that. Wendy, do you want to try to tackle that as to how folks look at how to help those citizens living away?
So, yeah, off reserve is so difficult because again, you're dealing with fee simple land, and I would assume that these off reserve, they're homeowners again, but it would be a case by case basis. One of the things that I know I was speaking to, I think it's one of the bands in Alberta, and what they did is that they took a portion of a trust that they had, and they used that as a basis for lending to the members, you know, whether they be on reserve or off reserve, and so they would give them, you know, fairly low interest loans to be able to use for whatever reason, whether it's building their own businesses or renovating their houses or doing whatever. And so that way they were, you know, it was through their own trust monies that they were financing or giving out these loans. And they had been very, very successful in that there was a 0% non-payment from, you know, repayment at the time that they were giving this talk. But I mean, that's just an example of an innovative way that maybe the band could use their own money or the trust money that's held in trust for future generations, but, you know, on a lower interest rate or something to their members, so that they're able to do those things that they want to do off reserve. That's just an example that comes off the top of my head, but it's a thought of just thinking outside the box a little bit of how bands can support their off reserve members.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to you, Jason, for this, and I think I'll ask all of our panelists maybe try to use this question as some of the wrap up. Some of the audience members here have been asking about creating an economy in the community with housing, with infrastructure, and basic ways to create that kind of market, if you will. Not just market for housing. Now, most of the questions have been around market housing. How do you create a market on a First Nation reserve? You have that off reserve. You know what the markets are doing. You know the houses have resale value, etc. But is there a way to do that for housing? Is there also a way to do that for infrastructure, where it becomes part of the economy, and as such, it becomes then a vehicle by which funding can be raised, financing can be raised, and becomes a way to address the housing and infrastructure needs in those communities? I'll start with you, Jason, then I'm going to ask that, just so you're not taken by surprise, Wendy. I'm going to ask that of everybody the same questions. Jason.
I'd say it's a fantastic question, and I think it's you know, increasing participation in the housing sector, in the infrastructure sectors, is really important. I think right now we have, you know, maybe the growth of the housing and infrastructure sector has been stifled for 100 years or so because of the Indian Act, I'd argue. And as we're finding new ways to do things and ways to get out from under the Indian Act, I think there's opportunities to create more activity with respect to housing and infrastructure. Whether it's in increased activity in housing construction, certainly, in the financial aspect of it. We know that the private sector housing industry is a massive industry off reserve, and we just don't see as much activity, I don't think, on reserve. But in terms of the infrastructure projects, one thing we've heard through community engagement that we've been doing, on the project that I mentioned, a pilot project, is a desire for capacity development and a desire for economic development and participation, not just in the approval of the project, but from the feasibility study to the construction to the operations and the maintenance of the project. So local capacity development is a priority, and there are ways, we believe, to embed requirements for local participation throughout the process, from the request for proposals to the feasibility study through to the procurement of the project and the requirements for local participation, through to the operation of the project. And that could be a separate contracting term and responsibility, but could include requirements for local participation. So I think it is vital. It's to be able to assert jurisdiction over our lands, over our infrastructure, to build the capacity to understand how to plan it, how to build it, and how to operate it. And that's jobs and that's employment. So I think it's a great question, and I know others probably have more to add on the housing side. I sort of have more on the infrastructure side. Thanks, Jeff.
Tracy, do you want to take it over from there?
Sure. Just thinking about urban and rural housing strategies and the opportunities for there to always be taken into consideration that socioeconomic impact that the First Nation government is mandated to look after its membership on and off reserve, housing and other education and many other things that are required for each member based on their stage of life. And then you also have the development corporations who's mandated to make money and make best use of any land acquisitions that they purchase under the development corporation. So you kind of have to meet in the middle somewhere between the board of directors and the chief and council to form almost a socioeconomic committee that will take into account what are our housing strategies for both rural and urban. You see the trend coming now where there's a lot of settlements and trusts and investment management portfolios being built around infrastructure and housing. But I do believe that they recognize that in order to have employees, the human resource component for economic development ventures, you need your members to move home, but they can't move home because of the lack of housing. So a lot of it, you have to address through land acquisition. Land acquisition that will be held under 100% owned real estate holdco under the nation, where there is no direct impact or arm's length required from a development corporation board? Or do you use the development corporation board as a vehicle to purchase land specifically for urban housing, which we see a lot of because we have kids going to school, we have elders that need health care, which is more appropriate for them at times to be located in the urban area. So we are seeing the development of land acquisition and urban reserves where they purchase it, and then over time after the financing is paid out and they don't really need that to backstop as collateral security per se for a financial institution, they can then convert that to addition to reserve process and have the same benefits of living on reserve but in an urban location. So we see the trend heading down that path to assist with all of the above, right?
Great, thank you. Tracy, Wendy, I'm going to give you the last word. We're almost at the top of the hour, so you get the last word.
Thank you. So I think that I would end off with my view is that I think it takes, all departments, everybody together to work together to try and find solutions. one of the, the economic development corporations are created to build own source revenues for the band and for the community. But that's not the only reason they're there. They're there to also give jobs to members. That's general, been a large part of a lot of them. Their mandate is to provide sustainable work for those people who live on reserve or off reserve, and then it becomes that, as Tracy talked about, a kind of a vicious circle. How do you get them jobs if they come home, there's no place for them to live, and that sort of thing. But I think that is kind of the basis of what you have to build your plan around. You need a plan. You need to start with a CCP, build a land use plan, figure out, to try and determine whether you have, land. How do you go about getting, additions to reserve so that you can build more housing, and a variety. So again, it takes everybody's contribution into this: lands, taxation, economic development, housing, all of those different departments to work together to try and figure out, to come up with a larger overreaching plan to address all of those challenges that come with this topic, for sure. So I would say that it's not land's responsibility, it's not an individual department's responsibility, it's everybody's responsibility to try and come up with solutions and innovative solutions to this issue.
Great. Thank you very much, Wendy. And thank you to all of our speakers. I appreciate very much you taking the time today to be part of this conversation. And thank you for the information. If I could sort of sum up as I was listening to the conversation and listening to your presentations, a couple of things come to mind. It's obvious that there's not enough money within Canada and through any kind of way that we structure a new authority or the way that we create new corporations, et cetera. We need to find other ways than just waiting for or depending on Canada to be able to provide that. And we need to look at other sources and need to look at that innovative approach. The things that I heard was talking about financial planning, building capacity locally, partnerships within the community, but partnerships outside the community as well, and finding those sources and those other players that we can bring to the table. I think that's important because it's not going to come from one source, and the solution can't be just one dimensional. So thank you very much for your time and your comments. To all those who have stuck with us during the webinar today, we thank you very much for that. Each of the questions that were left unanswered, and there are a few that didn't get addressed specifically, we will answer your questions. So please don't feel offended. We will address the questions and respond to you back through the website. There will be also a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation that Tracy provided that we'll include on the website as well, that adds some background and some more information and detail to her earlier comments. So you'll be able to go and locate or find that presentation from the Royal Bank and from Tracy as well on the website later on. Our next webinar, for those who are marking their calendars, is October 14th at 11 a.m. There will be engagement sessions coming up over the next little while. Our regional engagement coordinators will be making contact with all of you who have been attending, and they will be posting as well on the website some more details about these regional engagement sessions. These are an opportunity for you at a more local level to get involved, to ask questions, to provide your ideas, and to look for feedback on how we can look at funding and financing opportunities for First Nations and for the First Nations citizens living away. And we'll try to figure out some timing around those, but watch our website and wait for some outreach by our regional engagement coordinators on that subject. The last thing is the poll that just came up. We would like all of you, if you would just take a few moments to answer some of the questions that are there. We need your feedback. It's important for us to help us make sure that we've got these designed and are addressing the questions and the issues that you want us to address and that are needed to be discussed. So once again, thank you to everybody for your participation, and thank you to Wendy, to Tracy, and to Jason for their time and their willingness to put themselves in front of the camera and offer their opinions and take whatever might come from you. So we appreciate that very, very much. And thank you again for being part of this webinar today. We'll see you on the 14th. Bye for now.